How do you begin to understand and unravel the complex issues in the urgently required social changes of our times? How do you respond to your Black friend? What difference will your words and actions make in the grand scheme of things? Everything. Your words and your actions mean everything in social change. But thinking about these questions can render us powerless when it comes to complex social change issues like racial justice and equity. Nothing seems like the right thing to do or say. Everything seems uncomfortable, awkward, and messy. And so instead of figuring out a way forward, we humans tend to do something very strange in these circumstances. Instead of coming together and figuring out a collective way forward, we bury our heads in the sand. And this, in turn, creates even more awkwardness, uncomfortable, and messy interactions, assumptions, and questions. Here are some stories to illustrate how this disconnection shows up in my everyday life. First, there's you and I, friend. We meet in community, but rather than let our friendship bloom naturally, you insist on peppering me with questions about my history, my heritage, and my hair. I'm most intrigued with the question, how do I wash my hair? Because I wonder, how do you wash yours? You already know the basics of hair hygiene, and that is really all you need to know. I give it a good try because I'm hoping things will get better over time. But then one day it occurs to me, your questions are not making me feel connected to you. Instead, they are increasing the space between us because I feel objectified. And then I immediately think, well, maybe I'm overreacting, until my children start to come home asking me how they must respond to these same questions. And I realize we're playing out a harrowing and unholy tradition, generation after generation. I call this response the learned ignorance response. Because you might be thinking even now, as people have said to me before, well, how am I to learn if I do not ask? And I invite you instead to consider, what are the systemic reasons that have you knowing so little about Black people? And then there's you and I, work colleague. We meet at a session on power and privilege and engaging across difference to continue the rituals of diversity conversations that our organizations are engaging in. We simulate the racial privilege advantage by working in two groups. One group is given all the supports and resources they need, and they're given a couple buys along the way. Another group is given less resources and less support. They have roadblocks placed in their way, and they are given no buys at all. We debrief the activity, and you make your way to me afterward, and you say, where are you from? I smiled, a bit resigned to the fact that some form of this was bound to happen in this space. And because I sense you are looking for the answer of my ethnic ancestry, I say Sierra Leone instead of Canada. You proceed to tell me all about your grandson's glorious adoption story from Somalia. Why did you feel the need to do so, even though Sierra Leone and Somalia are in completely polar opposite ends of the continent they share? Because you could feel the dissonance and discomforts of the truths you just experienced, but you wanted me to know, me who now represented all of Africa and all Blackness, to know that you are doing your part. You have Black family after all. I say nothing. And as you continue, you begin to flush, because you begin to realize that in my shoes, what you are saying makes no difference. And that based on what we just experienced, I will need you to do much more than adopt children who look like me from the zeitgeist of the system that we are stuck in without being part of changing the system at all. And this will require that you further understand your privilege. And so this response I call the awkward defensive response. And then there's you and I, expert in all things social change, higher educator, social policy influencer, literal world changer. There we are at a conference, exchanging ideas, and you seek me out to tell me that you are impressed by me. And then you say, you are different. What is your background? As I look at you taking this in, it's a rhetorical question because you proceed to answer it yourself by interrogating the line in my bio where I identify as global African who was born in Germany, grew up in Sierra Leone, and currently living in Canada. And you say, African elite, makes sense. I'm stunned. Because I may have expected this out there, but coming from you, the implications of what you just said are not lost on me. And as I look at you, I say to you that I do not think that that is the whole story or the right way to engage with me in this space. Because you already know that it is ridiculous for you to consider not what is normative for you to be elite and different for me and for the parents that had transcended the boundaries that they did and modeled excellence so that I could be in that space. We did this politely, of course, and you still dismiss me and walk away. And as you leave, I find myself thinking of my Auntie Fatu. Auntie Fatu is all I wanted to be when I grew up, moved and inspired as I was by her intelligence, her dignity, her wisdom, and her grace. So when I returned to Sierra Leone after years of being away, I sought out Auntie Fatu and told her that I would be honored to have her be a witness and sign my wedding registry. Auntie Fatu cried. Overwhelmed with joy, she looked at me and said, "But me pikin I no sabi write, but my child, I cannot write." And I told her that we had considered this and she could sign by fingerprint or that we would teach her to sign her name. Auntie Fatu proudly signed my registry on that day. As you walk away, I think about the fact that Auntie Fatu could teach you and I and everyone else in this room much more than I ever could with my Western acceptability about what it might mean to create sustainable change and engage rural and urban and suburban African women. But I worried in that moment that to you, she would only be a statistic, a stereotype, a symbol to open these proceedings as an African elder if allowed into the room at all. This response is the replay of social rank, sadly, at its finest. Disconnection is a survival and defense mechanism, but one that causes real harm to real people. It can be unconscious at first, but eventually it becomes consciously unconscious. It becomes a choice. For example, in this moment in history, there's hundreds of years of evidence about the impacts that these everyday interactions, and even worse, have on Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and what that means for our society. And yet, there's only one statistic that concerns me today. And that is the statistic that in current Canadian research, on average, 50% of non-Black Canadians, and in other cases, Canadians in general, believe that systemic racism is an issue at all. 50% of Canadians believe that systemic racism is an issue at all. That statistic illustrates the disconnection of our times. So how do you get past disconnection? First, you choose to say yes. Then you find your resonance. Peter Block, expert in organization development, community building, and civic engagement, says this: the answer to how is yes. It's a metaphor of sorts to signify that we, humanity, can sometimes continue to ask questions and stay in a conversation as a deflection from commitment when the issues are too complicated for us to comprehend, instead of coming together to commit and find solutions. And so, to move past disconnection, we must say yes, which means saying yes with our heads, because as Peter, who likes to be known as citizen and friend, would say, yes is the end of argument. It means no longer arguing with the data and the evidence and saying yes to a massive unraveling of the systems and the structures and the processes at every level that keep us locked in these systemic situations that are untractable and have not been changing over time as much as they need to. It means saying yes with your heart. That means letting go of these narrow stories that do not dignify the diversity and the humanity of Black peoples globally, and welcoming me and mine and every Black person you encounter as your beloved. And it means saying yes with your hands. Much more than token actions or reading books, although that's a start to get past that learned ignorance, but taking action for true change and systemic change over time. You know, this year, with the on-video suffocation of George Floyd, more of us have probably gone to work globally than was the case perhaps since the end of apartheid in South Africa that engendered global movements and protests, or the civil rights movements in the United States. As we know from current events, between those landmark moments, so much has continued to happen that have had Black peoples continuing to work and to resist and to look for ways that we can all collectively move forward in a world of social justice and equity. And that is because Black people have continued to die and to struggle. Whether to police brutality, or to war and armed conflict over blood diamonds, or to modern day slavery across the seas in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, or to everyday violence against Afro-descendants in North and South America, or Afro-Europeans, Afro-Asians, or Afro-Oceanics, we have kept struggling, but we have kept moving forward. And this is an opportunity for all of us to do so, because for this pandemic, the vaccine is all of us. Yes breaks us out of disconnection and frees us to look for solutions to social justice and change. But we can still flame out when working on these complex and frankly traumatic issues. So 10 years ago in my life as a researcher, I asked African and Black leaders who were making significant changes in their communities and in the world for social justice and racial equity, what it took to get to yes and to stay there. And they all described a similar phenomenon that I labeled resonance. And over these 10 years, I have seen resonance occur in the same way over time in different groups, in different organizations, and in different forums where social change is the topic at hand. Resonance in its simplest form is a guiding story. It's the story that comes to mind in answer to the question, what is a personal story that deeply connects you to issues of social justice? We all have that resonance story. It's a human story. For you, it might be the memory of growing up in poverty and smelling and feeling and knowing what that feels like, and wanting that to be different for everyone else in the world. For you, it might be having raised that child that you worried about and seeing them thrive in the world and deciding you wanted to make sure that every child had equal opportunity so that they could grow up and thrive in that same way. These human stories could be stories of extraordinary joy or extraordinary pain, but they anchor leaders to the reason why they stand for social change and social justice. And it allows them to carry on when the going gets tough, because it does. And so when it comes to the movement for justice for our Black lives, this is my resonance story. It centers around my children. And the time in the same time frame when my daughter came home from school in about grade 4 and said to me that a classmate had said to her that no one wanted to play with her because no one wanted to play with a little Black girl. Shortly after, my son, the older of 2, who was in grade 2 at the time, came home and said to us that he no longer wished to be Black or African. He said this because in a well-meaning presentation about global citizenship and service, without regard to his humanity, he left with the message that Black and African children are only dirty and poor. This broke my heart, as you can see and imagine. And it was a double whammy that propels me forward and gives me resonance to stand on stages like this and invite all of us to say yes and find that resonance story. Starting from the commitment of yes and locking in on your resonance story won't take away the awkwardness, I'm sorry. But it does give you a different entry point to work from and to stand in a real and humane way and acknowledge this is awkward, but I commit to moving forward. How can we get there together? I have seen resonance shift conversations and actions so many times in the last 10 years. And so next time when you find yourself in that place of influence, say yes. Call on your resonance story individually and collectively and buckle in for the ride, because there's nothing more powerful in social change than the transformative power of our own personal stories. Will you say yes and find your resonance story to move from disconnection to connection in social change? Thank you.